Being a parent or becoming a parent, it changes your whole life. And so, of course, it will change the countries that you're considering for hijrah. When you're thinking of raising your kids to have the best dunya and the best akhirah, you need to keep them in mind when you're picking your countries. So in a previous video, I discussed the different criteria that you're going to want to think about when it comes to hijrah and raising kids. But in this video, I'm going to go through the specific countries and their pros and cons when it comes to raising your kids and your kids' development and their dunya and akhirah in each of those countries. And keep in mind, I'm somebody who's lived in 4 different Muslim countries. I have a few kids of my own, alhamdulillah, and I'm currently raising them, for now at least, in Algeria. Let's start with the popular one, the Gulf, right? Obviously the Gulf, you have different vibes of the Gulf. You've got Oman, you've got UAE, Saudi, this and that. I grew up in the Gulf. I grew up in the UAE. I spent a little bit of time in Saudi Arabia as well. I also visited Oman, I visited Bahrain, etc. It's a funny place to grow up, because it's just different from any other place in the world, I think. You can't really integrate into the society because there is no wider culture to integrate into. Now, in some neighborhoods, there are definitely people who integrated into the Emirati society. But the Emiratis, as you know, they're like 10% of the country. Like, depending on where you live, they're between like 5 and 20% of the population. Very few of them. And to be honest, they do kind of keep to themselves. Some of them even just keep within their tribe. So it's a bit hard to kind of penetrate that. And so what you find in the UAE is you've just got a lot of different bubbles. You know, even the kids at school, I remember, very multicultural society, as you would know. Even within schools, you often find a lot of different people. But even the schools can be kind of segregated into bubbles. So you'll find Indian schools where Indian kids go only. You find Pakistani schools where Pakistani kids kind of go only. You find Arab schools, maybe with American curriculum, but it's mostly that Arab kind of vibe. And then you have the fully Western schools, which are British curriculum, American curriculum, even French schools I've seen where it's all French speakers and French curriculum. And these are more like, have a lot of Westerners, but it will also have maybe some Asians and Arabs and stuff in there as well. So even on the school level, there is quite a bit of segregation. And so where can you find that your kids integrate? Like, yes, they might go to school, they'll integrate with the types of kids in that school. But then in the wider society, how do they integrate? There isn't really integration. It's kind of weird, but there isn't so much of a universal culture in the UAE to even integrate into. You kind of have your bubble, and then between bubbles, there is this gray zone, which is the general UAE culture, which is, it's kind of, I don't know, it's very hard to describe it, but it's just this multiculturalism type of thing where people respect each other, people are nice with each other, people generally speak English with each other, but they're distant because ultimately, generally, people from South Asia are going to be friends with people from South Asia. Generally, Arabs are going to be friends with Arabs. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this, but this is what I found growing up, and I don't see how it would have changed since. And also because of this, the Islamic culture element is limited in the UAE because there isn't this wider big society that you can integrate in, and they've got like decades or hundreds of years of this culture and this common culture, especially an Islamic common culture that they can all relate to. Everyone has kind of had quite a different upbringing, and so I find that there isn't this unifying culture. And so I think the Islamic element of the culture is quite weak. I guess I'm mostly focusing on the UAE because that's what I know. I think this would be much stronger in Saudi. I think Saudi is an exception to a lot of the Gulf countries because it has a much larger local population. And so Saudi is a bit of an exception to the stuff I'm talking about. I've seen kids grow up in Saudi and really kind of integrate into the general Saudi culture and like have friends who are Saudi and this and that. And you find people in Saudi from other countries, not just the West as well, who are like, have integrated into society. You find South Asians who speak Arabic much better. You find Somalis fully integrated. You find people from West Africa, from everything, who are really like more into the general society. So I think Saudi is an exception to that. But the other Gulf countries are kind of like this. There isn't that wider Islamic culture to integrate into. Of course, safety is definitely not an issue in a lot of these countries or all these countries. Safety, you wouldn't think twice. Yes, road safety, yes, you might be a bit worried about your kids crossing roads, etc. on their own. But, you know, generally it's okay compared to the world standard. But in terms of other kinds of safety, you know, you would really consider these countries to be very, very safe. So that's the positive with these countries for sure. In terms of education, most people are going to go to a private school. A lot of people complain about the fees of private schools. And what I always say to people about private schools is nobody is happy with their private school. Like generally, I don't think I've ever heard somebody who doesn't complain about the school that their kids go to. And so, you might not be happy, especially when you're paying that much money. I think that makes people complain a lot more. But the point is, you've got all these different schools that I mentioned, and that probably means if you're coming from the West, you're going to put your kids in a Western school, and then what is the culture going to be of that Western school? Maybe questionable. However, there might be some more Islamic options, and that's for you to find out. But ultimately, your kids are probably going to be in a private school, and it's probably going to cost quite a bit of money. Another good thing about the Gulf in general is that you can see options for your kids actually working there. Like if you imagined your kids going to uni there and then graduating and looking for jobs, you could imagine that they might get decent jobs in these countries. Now, maybe not as many options as elsewhere. Some of these countries are quite small, there's not too many jobs on offer, but you could see that it's a possibility they could get a decent level job and they could, stay in the country that they've been raised in. However, overall, what I would say from my experience growing up in the UAE is that I saw a pattern there. The pattern is that a lot of people that grew up in these countries, they had to leave eventually. And they often left back to the Western country where they held a passport. Even if, their parents are Iraqi, or their parents are Jordanian, or their parents are Palestinian or Algerian, they would go back to the Western country that they held the passport in, the people of that background. So they go back to Canada, the US, the UK, etc. When they did that, I often found that they struggled. They struggled to kind of get into life and be more responsible and take on responsibilities and kind of become an adult. I just found that they struggled. And it's not just a generational thing, because this was not so much an issue for people of my generation in other countries, but people that grew up in the Gulf, when they try and go into other countries that are more normal societies and setups, I found that they struggled. And it could be, this is my theory, it could be that when you live in these countries, you're quite pampered. A lot of responsibilities are taken off you. A lot of the time, if you're living in these countries, it means your parents have a decent job, and so you're quite comfortable. There's not, for example, a concept of teenagers getting jobs, working, anything like that. There aren't too many options for maybe like volunteering, or it's not part of the culture, volunteering in the masjid, stuff like that. It doesn't really exist. So in these countries, you're raising your kids in a very unique and special environment that they might not find elsewhere. And so if they ever leave, it might be quite hard for them to adapt. I just saw this as a kind of pattern, that people that grow up in the UAE, they struggle to get jobs outside later, or they struggle with their education. Like they just keep doing another degree, and they're just trying to find their way in life. I did find that as a pattern. And this is even Muslims, non-Muslims, people from all kinds of backgrounds. I just found that to be the case. It's all theory as to why this happens, but I did notice that pattern. And then also, because of this bubble setup that you have in terms of the society, if you're a British Muslim or a Western Muslim moving to the UAE, moving to Qatar, moving to Bahrain, you probably will end up hanging out and going to the same school as other Western Muslims. And so you're going to end up in a similar culture as if you were in the UK, but you're just in a new country. And your kids would miss out on that Islamic culture element that I talked about previously. And I think that's one of the main benefits of doing Hijrah and moving to the Muslim world, is getting access to that Islamic culture. And you wouldn't get that if you were living in this kind of bubble society where everybody kind of sticks to their own. So that's what I would say overall. There are advantages in terms of the potential for employment, maybe the easier residency option, so there's more stability, you can stay longer, maybe decent work opportunities, maybe this and that. But ultimately, for me, there are also quite a few downsides. So that is the Gulf. Next, we have what I would call normal Arab countries. Normal, I guess, meaning just not the Gulf, right? So you got like Algeria, Egypt, Morocco, maybe Jordan, these kind of countries. Now, these kind of countries are a bit less safe. There's a bit less of, a police presence everywhere, and things are a bit less regulated, etc. But it also depends on the lifestyle you lead, right? If you've got a bit more money, you can live in a bit of a safer neighborhood. If you've got a bit more money, then you can get a car, which means you avoid certain issues that come with like public transport, etc. So it kind of depends what lifestyle you end up living. But yeah, overall, you could say it's less safe, but it could be maybe as safe depending on the lifestyle that you lead. Now, when I say less regulated, I think it's interesting. Like, countries that have less rules and less like government enforcement everywhere. I think that leaves space for special things to happen, even if sometimes they're not safe. Sometimes it's a bit wacky. Sometimes you get weird outcomes when you don't regulate everything. But at the same time, it leaves space for people to develop things and people to build character and maybe skills and hobbies that they wouldn't in a very highly regulated environment. For example, the UAE is one of the most regulated countries in the world, I would say, in terms of, if you just want to start a chess club and you want to like rent out a little space for a chess club, I don't know if that's possible, but even if it's possible, like everything's like expensive, and then you need a permit and you need to officially register a club. Whereas in other countries like these normal Arab countries, it's just like, yeah, we'll just rent this place. I don't have to tell anyone really what I'm doing with the place. I'm just going to use it. Or, there are some regulations, but there's a more freedom to just do these like random kind of things that I think are great opportunities, especially for kids to try things out and take more initiative rather than waiting for an official business or club to be set up and then, okay, now you can come and you pay us and then we do this. But what about doing stuff your own way? What about going to the carpenter and asking him, can you just make this random thing? And because it's less regulated, it's kind of cheaper to just get these things done. So less regulation can mean less safety and less this and that, but it also gives space for interesting things to happen. And that's great for kids. Yes, and likewise, you have probably certain niche activities for your kids would not be as available in these countries, but all the other activities that are available would be cheaper as well. So that might allow your kids actually to end up doing more activities in the end, even though there might be less niche activities. For example, if you want your kids to get into like golf or like polo, you might not find that in the whole of Egypt or whatever, right? But because horse riding and martial arts is so much cheaper in Egypt, you find that all your kids do those activities because it's more affordable. And then the headline for these countries is the Islamic culture, the Islamic environment. These countries are normal in the sense where everybody in the country generally is from one background, one culture. Of course, there is upper class, middle class, this and that, but generally everyone's from the same culture. And Islamic culture generally, the way they talk, the way they behave, their worldview is generally quite Islamic. You do have the influence of globalist culture, liberal culture, feminist culture, this and that. But generally, everyone is following a similar culture. And of course, this depends on the city and the neighborhood and this and that as well. But you get that advantage of growing up with people and living with people who just view things quite differently to someone who's grown up in a Western culture, especially when it comes to Islam and its position in the world. These people know more about their history. They have an identity and history that they can connect to. And I'm not saying it's perfect, but I'm saying that identity exists. Whereas the British Muslim experience, for example, is quite disconnected in terms of your identity and your culture and your background of, where do I come from? Who are my great-grandparents? You're not that connected to it. Whereas these people are. And I think there's something special happens there, especially when the society is a more Islamically inclined one. Then education options. For Islamic education, these countries can be very good because like in Egypt, for example, there's so many teachers available and institutes, but on top of that, it's quite affordable. So it's a really good kind of place for that. And then with social integration, the benefit of having kind of one monoculture and one language is that you kind of have to learn it. And that if you learn it, you learn one culture and one language and you integrate with the whole society. And so I think integrating will be much more possible for your kids in these kind of countries if, of course, they learn the language and you make an active effort to like have them do activities or go to schools that the average Egyptian, Jordanian, whatever goes to. Then over a few years, you can definitely see that integration happening. And the good thing in these countries is I don't think necessarily the kids are going to be very racist or like, have an issue with foreign kids compared to other countries like maybe Turkey or something. And so overall, I think these kind of countries are less comfortable for the parents. The easiest thing for the parents, if it was, just, a man and his wife, is to go live in the Gulf and live comfortably and, go to the restaurants and the cafes and this. That's easy. It's hard to go to countries like Egypt, Algeria. It's harder, yani. But Allahu A'lam, I think it's better for kids. I think it gives them more real life experience, a richer childhood. It builds more character. It exposes them to a bit more adversity, but it doesn't have to be like really bad adversity. It's just some adversity. However, that does come coupled with lack of potential university options and work options. In these countries, you might think going to these universities, they might not benefit them elsewhere in the world. If they have the option to go to other countries and study and hold that degree from the UK or from the US, even from any other country, if they have that option, if they can afford it and the visa options, etc. are there, you might feel, why are they going to stay in this country and study here, right? And the same goes for work options. Imagine your kids spend 10 years, 15 years growing up in a country. And then when it comes to finding work, it's so difficult, or the salaries are so low that eventually, again, because they've got that passport, they find options abroad and they end up leaving after 15, 20 years and starting fresh in a new country. Now, don't get me wrong. I think they would benefit from all that character building that they've got in that country, but they still have to go abroad always for work or for university. So it doesn't mean necessarily that they're going to have to do that. You know, of course, there are millions and millions of people living a middle class, even upper class lifestyle in these countries. But there is that risk there. That's all I'm going to say. Okay, next we have Turkey. Turkey, I think it has a lot of the elements of the normal Arab countries. It's a bit safer maybe. It's a bit easier for parents because the convenience factor is a bit higher in the bigger cities in Turkey. I think integration is harder. I think even if you learn the Turkish language, I've heard a lot of stories of people struggling to be considered a normal person in Turkey, even if they speak the language perfectly. There's always that kind of racism option, which could show its ugly face. And then the Islamic environment, the Islamic culture definitely is lesser in Turkey. You do obviously have people who see the world in a very Islamic way, but the average person, probably not. They're probably more of a nationalistic thinking country. Their worldview is based on Turkey, not Islam and Ummah. And so that's not the best, but there are exceptions to that, of course. And then when it comes to work opportunities, university opportunities, you might be limited as well in Turkey. I think the reputation of Turkish universities is a bit better, but as the Turks maybe in the comments can say, the economy doesn't feel that hopeful in Turkey right now. Who knows, by the time your kids are that age, who knows what it will be like, but that's the case right now. And then we've got Pakistan, which I just thought I would throw in there because I know there are so many people from the UK watching my videos and they think of Hijrah and they might be of a South Asian, of a Pakistani background. And it's like, that's your country, or at least your parents' or grandparents' country. Is that an option for you? And I think it could have, I don't know, again, I've never been to Pakistan, okay? I feel like Pakistan might have some of those benefits of the normal Arab countries, where yes, it's a bit less convenient for the parents, but things are cheaper, so you can access more activities, more teachers. You've got that monoculture, mono-language kind of thing. Live a more normal, free childhood upbringing, and perhaps have that Islamic culture because, everyone in the country is Muslim, etc. So I'm not sure about integration. Like, again, if you're Pakistani, you have that background, you have that language, you could probably integrate. And especially if your kids are young, they could get used to it. But if you're not Pakistani, probably not an option as much as others. But it's still an interesting option, I think. And I have a friend who's born and raised in the UK, etc., with a Pakistani background. And he said, especially Islamabad is definitely a good option, something really to think about and consider. So if he said that, maybe in the future we can do a video with him about it. But yeah, Pakistan could be an option, could be good for kids' upbringing in the same way that those normal Arab countries have those advantages that I mentioned. So the question is, after talking about the criteria and the different countries, what am I doing? I find that there is a balance you need to strike between safety and control and the character building that your children experience. Environments that are very safe, very controlled, they might feel convenient to you and you feel like your children are safe, but at the same time, it might not leave much space for them to develop their character and be exposed to challenges. On the other hand, you've got places that are really dangerous and you just think, well, what's the point of them building their character if it's that dangerous? So you have to find wherever you feel is a good mix or balance between those two. And one thing I will say is that everything feels dangerous when you're new to it. But 6 months, 12 months into living in a country, you're going to know the real vibe. Is this really dangerous? Is this not? I know, for example, in Algeria, people are very paranoid about certain things. And I kind of question to myself, like, is it really bad? Or is it one of those rumor things where people just, talked their way into being really worried and scared about it? And they feel like it's very common when it might not be. And that's why you also have to control your media and the information that you consume. Once you get locked into the local social media thing, you're going to find a lot of people complaining about a lot of stuff in the country. Whereas me, as someone who's lived in 5 different countries, I often know that's not that bad. You're complaining about it as if this country is the only one that has this problem. But actually, this country is all right when it comes to that. So at the beginning, it's not a good time to judge whether somewhere is safe for your kids or not so much. Now, I'm somebody who really values, when it comes to raising my kids, I value independence, learning skills, building character. I want to like homeschool my kids. I would like for my boys to like work from a young age and just let kids in a somewhat controlled environment, let them learn from mistakes, let them do a lot of different things and learn from it, build character from it, build resilience. And so for me, I feel like the Gulf doesn't offer that too much. I feel like I'd be living that kind of American lifestyle, like, those moms with the van and they drive their kids from school to this club and this club to this club. And it's all a bit too controlled for my liking. I like a bit of chaos, you know what I mean? I would like a bit less control in that. And I think that's what you would live in the Gulf, is either your kids would just go to school and come back and then they'll be at home or online or whatever, or you'll be shuttling them from club to club, which is a better upbringing, I think, in general. But it doesn't leave space, I think, for some of the less regulated stuff to happen, which really builds character and resilience. And, it would be easy for me to move to the Gulf. That would be more comfortable for me, but I don't know if it would be the best for my kids' upbringing. And then on the flip side, living in Algeria, for example, for the foreseeable future, there are a few more risks. There are a few areas you have to be maybe a bit more careful, a bit more on point. But the biggest concern is, am I going to raise my kids here? And then when they're adults, they're going to feel the need to leave. And the question is, have I prepared them to leave and thrive in other countries? And that's where I want to keep my kids to be internationally minded. What I mean by that is they need to have access to multiple languages. So English and Arabic is good because it opens them up to the whole English-speaking world and the whole Arabic-speaking world. So that's really good. And I also want them to travel enough, ideally, to experience and know what's out there in the world beyond just Algeria. And so I plan to proactively take my kids places. And I'm talking about many different places like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, even Europe, Turkey, and just let them see what's available out there. Some of these countries in summer, for example, they have summer camps for kids. You can send your kids or just let them experience. And so I guess I'm trying to raise my kids in Algeria. That's the plan for now. But while also giving them a global view, an international view of what's out there, what's possible, what's available in the world. But now, as a parent, you might be wondering about the other factors in terms of choosing a country for hijrah. And so it's not just all about what's better for your kids. You've got other factors that you've got to keep in mind. So you can watch this video next, which tells you all about the countries I would recommend to do hijrah to in 2026, or this video, which is the countries I would not really recommend for your hijrah in 2026. So pick one of those two now, and I'll see you over there.